welcome to week 4's novel, which is Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey. In this session, we're going to talk about the Gothic Parody, which is what Northanger Abbey is. Northanger Abbey is a Gothic parody. Jane Austen satirizes this huge obsession with Gothic novels in the late 18th century and early 19th century. So before we move on to the idea of the Gothic parody and the variations of it in terms of how the critics approach the concept of Gothic parody that is seen in Northanger Abbey, let's first look at Jane Austen and her context and the kind of works that she wrote. Jane Austen lived in turbulent times. She was born on 17th December 1775, the year in which the American War of Independence commenced. Moreover, England was threatened with revolution and was at war with France for a large part of Austen's adult life. You can see the various wars listed against the timeline of Jane Austen. When she was born, the American War of Independence began. So America was trying to become independent from the mother country, Great Britain, and there was this war going on. The long war with France was going on during her lifetime, and we can see minor references to the war. For example, in Persuasion, we have the naval men being used as significant characters in that fiction. So even though Jane Austen doesn't do a lot of political fiction, there are minor references to the militia, to the naval folks. For example, in Pride and Prejudice, there is a reference to the militia, and Elizabeth Bennet's sister falls in love with one of the military men, and the consequences are not very ideal. Although none of these historical events can be linked directly with Austen and her novels, the anxiety instigated by the French Revolution is said to have caused the Gothic exposition in English literature of the late 18th century. If you remember that previous slide, there was a reference to the fear of revolution in Great Britain as well, and that fear was caused by the revolution that took place in France. So you can see how the fear that the societal structure is going to be radically changed is there, and the direct threat of war and the direct threat of revolution was also brought forth because of the French Revolution. And we also saw in the previous lectures how the Gothic subgenre itself was seen as an outcome, the literary outcome of a political shift, a radical political shift. So the terror and the horror of the French Revolution was somehow kind of channeled, through words in this kind of narrative, which is the Gothic. As many of Austen's letters to family and friends and the tales in the Juvenilia exemplify, Austen took a keen pleasure in gossip and the sensational. Moreover, her parody of the Gothic novel, Northanger Abbey, shows that she enjoyed reading the literature of terror and had a thorough understanding of the genre and its conventions. So there are two kind of points in this comment here on the slide. One is that Austen was interested in the sensational, and that idea is kind of indicated to us through her letters and through the Juvenilia, the fiction that she wrote when she was very young. So you can also see how very closely the idea of gossip and the sensational and Gothic is related. All these things seem to be associated topics, and they also have a kind of a feminine framework. Women are usually found to be indulging in gossip. Women do read a lot of sensational fiction as well as Gothic fiction, and Austen had a keen interest apparently in the Gothic novel, which is why she was very capable, and she does a brilliant job of satirizing, parodying the Gothic novel, because she knew the conventions of the genre. Now let's have a quick look at the kind of fiction that Jane Austen wrote and published. Sense and Sensibility was published in 1811, Pride and Prejudice in 1813, which he referred to as My Own Darling Child. So Pride and Prejudice is a spectacular success. It continues to be successful to this day, and there are plenty of adaptations of that novel, and you can see how different generations relate to these works of Jane Austen. In his journal, Sir Walter Scott contrasted her exquisite touch with his own big bow wow approach, praising the way she made commonplace things and characters interesting from the truth of the description and the sentiment. So there are two points here with relation to Scott's comment on the kind of writing Austen produced. He kind of describes his own way of writing, which he calls the big bow wow approach. There's a huge scale. Things are captured in a larger scale in Scott's fiction. He writes historical fiction. Narratives are about succession, about heirs, kingdoms. However, if you look at Austen, her domain is smaller. Domesticity becomes the central subject of her fiction. So that's one point that Scott tries to bring out, the comparison between her miniature way of capturing society and his own larger historical focus. And the other is, he points out that Austen is trying to, give a lot of truth to her fiction through the sentiment, through the way she kind of captures the description, through the way she captures characters in her work. So there's also another related point that you can see, which is the subtext to this kind of description, which is how ordinary things become extraordinary, how there is truth in the ordinary, and this kind of subject matter. The importance given to the commonplace is also a major trajectory of the romantic movement, and you can see how there is a connection between romantic philosophy and Gothic as well, which we kind of discussed in the previous lectures. So there is a lot of truth in her description, in her sentiments, and the people and the places in her works are commonplace, ordinary, regular folks that you would meet on an everyday. Mansfield Park, a novel by Austen, was published in 1814, and Emma was also published in 1815. Emma is very interesting because it is supposed to be a it's supposed to be a favorite with the author herself, and Austen half jokingly predicted that no one but myself will much like the central character Emma. Emma discusses the egotism of the central character and the plans she kind of comes up with to manage the society in which she is a part of. So it's a very, very interesting novel in that regard. It's a very mature novel, and as I said, it's a favorite with the author. Austen died only aged 41 on 18 July 1817, leaving The Subtle Persuasion and her Gothic satire Northanger Abbey to be published later that year. So Persuasion and Northanger Abbey were published together after her death, so they were posthumous publications. If you look at Jane Austen's works, you can see how very strong her female characters are. You can go back to Sense and Sensibility. You will find Eleanor and Marianne as central characters, and with regard to Mansfield Park, we have Fanny Price, the really modest and reserved Fanny Price, kind of emerging as a very powerful character as the novel progresses. And then in Persuasion, we have Anne Elliot, again she begins as a very marginal character in the novel, and as the novel progresses, she comes to kind of capture the attention of everybody around her. And Catherine Morland is the central female character in Northanger Abbey, and you can see how all these novels, and Emma, of course, is based on the central character as well as it's a novel which kind of captures the growth and maturity of the central character. So it's about a kind of a female's growth trajectory, and it's a kind of a feminine bildungsroman in some respects. So there is a parallel with this kind of fiction with Gothic fiction, and usually we have several female characters trying to kind of maneuver their way around all the minefields. So you can see how there is a close parallel between domestic realism on the one hand and Gothic fiction. Northanger Abbey was published posthumously in 1817. Northanger Abbey was published with Persuasion, as I said, in 4 volumes, and was probably written about 1798 or 1799. So it's a kind of a late 18th century work, but it remained unpublished until after the death of Jane Austen. In 1803, the manuscript of Susan was sold to the publisher, Richard Crosby, who advertised for it, but unaccountably it was not published at that time. Susan is the title given to Northanger Abbey in its first version, and Jane Austen goes back to it and revises the novel and retitles it as Northanger Abbey. So you can see how that revisions are crucial to the way narratives are structured, especially with regard to Jane Austen. Now, Radcliffe's fiction was the natural target for Jane Austen's satire in Northanger Abbey. The book's novel-loving heroine, Catherine Morland, imposes on reality the Gothic plots with which she is familiar. So if you read the novel, you will know that Catherine Morland is a person who is hooked by the Gothic fiction that she reads, Mysteries of Udolpho and Castle of Otranto, The Monk. So all these novels are consumed by Catherine Morland and Isabella Thorpe, her friend. And she tries, this heroine of Jane Austen in Northanger Abbey tries to impose on reality the Gothic structure, the Gothic characters, the Gothic plots that she has read, that she has fed on. So she tries to kind of see reality through the lens of Gothic fiction, and Austen is considered to satirize the Gothic narratives in Northanger Abbey. But is she really satirizing? That's another question which we will kind of address as this lecture progresses. Here we have the title page of Northanger Abbey and Persuasion. They were published together. And you can see the reference to the author there. It says, by the author of Pride and Prejudice and Mansfield Park, etc., with a biographical sketch notice of the author in 4 volumes, and it was published in 1818. This is the title page of the work which was published in 1818. Northanger Abbey is far more complex than it might seem, particularly so since a surprising number of readers and critics seem to consider the text simply in terms of its layers of parody, treating it as nothing more than a light-hearted spoof. Jane Austen's novels are complex. All her novels are complex, but this novel, Northanger Abbey, is more complex because everybody, at least a large number of critics, seem to consider the novel as just a parody. It just seems to be a kind of a light-hearted spoof, a mockery of something that was very popular, which is the Gothic. So what exactly is the novel doing using this parody is something which is very significant. While Austen is engaged in pointing out the absurdity of many Gothic inventions throughout the novel, this is far from her only concern with the form. Rather, her work is simultaneously a critique and a defense of books like The Mysteries of Udolpho and The Monk. So this is a very key point which has been brought out by this critic, Alex Skopik, who argues that while Austen is mocking the Gothic conventions in Northanger Abbey, she is also simultaneously defending books such as Mysteries of Udolpho. So there is a critique as well as a defense of the genre. So this is a very contradictory point, but it's also a valid one if you read the novel very, very carefully. So how does she defend it? So that's the question that begs to be asked, and let's try to kind of answer that. For her characters, the Gothic's haunted castles and specters are nothing compared to the very real societal horrors of the Regency, its gendered power structure and ideology. So on the one hand, we have the haunted castles and the specters, the supernatural elements which are used in Gothic fiction. But on the other hand, in the Regency, the period in which Austen lived, there was a different kind of horror. That horror was produced by the reality of society, and that horror gets captured in this parody. So while she is parodying, mocking, satirizing the Gothic conventions, she is also kind of capturing the terrors in society and using those terrors to scare the Gothic heroine, quote unquote, which is Catherine Morland. This motive is exemplified not only in Northanger Abbey with Jane Tilney as the art Gothic villain and exploiter, but in Sense and Sensibility, where the logic of coercion and dehumanization the society relies on is thrown into sharp relief by Eliza Williams' tragic end. The Gothic motif of arch villain is clearly exemplified in the figure of Jane Tilney, and that is really done in a clear-cut manner. But there are other villains who kind of embody the societal horror, and one such example is Willoughby in Sense and Sensibility, Willoughby who seduces Eliza Williams. So you can see how Jane Austen uses some of the horrors in society and kind of packages it neatly through this Gothic parody, and it's a kind of a double-edged tool. It is a parody. It can make the readers laugh at it. At the same time, by laughing at it, we also realize that it's perhaps not a parody, that there is a kind of a larger significance, a more subtle and more potent significance when we realize that the castles may not be very oppressive in a literal manner, but there is a lot of oppression subtly going on inside the walls of Northanger Abbey, the mansion of General Tilney. Now, far from a harmless parody, then Northanger Abbey marks a turning point where Jane Austen injected the Gothic with a new level of social, political, economic critique, a tradition that endures to this day. Catherine Morland, the daughter of a country parson, is the innocent abroad who gains worldly wisdom, first in the fashionable society of Bath and then at Northanger Abbey itself, where she learns not to interpret the world through her reading of Gothic thrillers. Northanger Abbey criticizes both polite society and also satirizes Gothic tales of terror. We have Catherine Morland, who's just the daughter of a country parson, but she is very, very innocent, and when she travels, there is a lot that she needs to learn about society, especially the fashionable society of Bath, and again, she undergoes a steep learning curve at Northanger Abbey, the Gothic structure at the heart of the novel, and she kind of learns that she should not read the world as she would read a Gothic thriller. And you can see how this novel is structured as the growing up story of a heroine. So it can also be categorized as a female Gothic in some respects. It becomes a female Gothic because we have at the heart of it a character who is undergoing the process of learning something with regard to a Gothic plot, and she imagines that she is traversing that Gothic plot in a literal manner, but there is a psychological Gothic plot as well, and she realizes that while General Tilney may not be a Gothic villain in a very formulaic sense, but he is very oppressive and he is against the wishes of his children. So you can see that there is a very strong case that can be made to define this novel as an example of female Gothic. Now, Austen is not ridiculing the Gothic romance in this novel, Northanger Abbey. Instead, Austen heightens the common anxiety present in the Gothic novel by interposing the Gothic machinery into the given machine of Northanger Abbey's common life. Wild argues that Austen is not quite a parodist but almost an imitator of the works of Radcliffe. In other words, she is in fact an heiress of Radcliffe. To kind of continue my earlier point about female Gothic, here the critic argues that what is happening in Northanger Abbey is not a ridicule, not a mockery of it. Instead, the anxiety that is prevalent in Gothic fiction is present in this fiction as well, in Northanger Abbey, and Austen is instead of parodying is imitating the works of Radcliffe. So one can argue that she is in fact an heiress to and Radcliffe, the one who started the Gothic school. So as we talked about the nature of the Gothic in the previous lectures and arrived at the conclusion that there is a prevalent sense of fear, there's also a prevalent sense of anxiety, especially on the part of the female character, the central female character. And that anxiety is also very much present in Catherine Morland here in this novel. There's an anxiety for her to belong to the society in which she is present. There's an anxiety for her to kind of understand the workings of Northanger Abbey. There's an anxiety on her part to kind of make sure that Henry Tilney, the son, falls in love with her. Now let's look at the nature of the plot of Northanger Abbey. As we kind of realize, this is the coming of age story of this naive, highly impressionable protagonist, Catherine Morland. She's very young, she's very innocent, and she is highly impressionable, and she's traveling in this story. The book is divided into two sections. In part one, we have Catherine visiting Bath with her family friends, the Allens. While there, Catherine is introduced to the duplicitous Isabella Thorpe, a very, very remarkable young woman, but one who is very duplicitous as well. She's someone who cannot be trusted, and she also has a brother. We'll come to that. So she's introduced to Isabella Thorpe, but also to the kind-hearted and sensible Tilney siblings, Eleanor and Henry. Eleanor and Henry are the children of General Tilney. So Isabella is a kind of a foil to Catherine Morland. Catherine is immediately attracted to Henry, who engages her in conversation and gently mocks her about her Gothic reading habits. So we can see the kind of the parody beginning in this kind of conversation that takes place between Henry Tilney and Catherine Morland. Isabella Thorpe also reads a lot of Gothic fiction. Her brother, John Thorpe, also pretends to read a lot of Gothic fiction. So you can see a lot of talk about reading, fiction reading goes on in this fiction. After some time, Catherine learns of Isabella's manipulation of her brother, James Morland. Isabella has courted James, accepted his engagement, and then jilted him for Captain Frederick Tilney, and she decides to leave Isabella and Bath and accompany Eleanor and Henry to their home, Northanger Abbey. So Isabella's character is further established as fraudulent when we realize how she breaks up her engagement with James Morland, who is the brother of Catherine Morland. So she jilts him in order to get engaged to Captain Frederick Tilney, the elder son of General Tilney, and Catherine decides to leave Bath and travel with Eleanor and Henry to their home, Northanger Abbey. So when Catherine Morland finds herself in Northanger Abbey, she imagines herself to be a Gothic heroine, and she imagines this place to be a place of oppression, literal oppression, and she tries to figure out more information about the place that she is in. So in a series of comic episodes, Catherine imagines Northanger Abbey and its inhabitants as enacting her beloved Gothic scripts. Eventually, Henry learns of her Gothic imaginings and chastises her for them. Shortly after, Catherine is dismissed from the abbey by Henry's father, General Tilney, because he learns that Catherine does not have a family fortune, and so she would be a poor match for his son. Ultimately, Catherine and Henry reconcile, and despite General Tilney's disapproval of their union, marry. So you can see how Catherine Morland tries to kind of walk through the labyrinthine pathways of Northanger Abbey, trying to find out hidden plots. And in her wanderings, she comes across Henry Tilney, and he chastises her, takes her to task for imagining things about this structure, this mansion, and she is very embarrassed and ashamed of what she has done, and begs his forgiveness. And later, General Tilney dismisses her from the abbey because he realizes that she is very poor, she does not have a fortune, and therefore she would not be an ideal match for his son. Catherine Morland leaves the abbey in tears, but later Henry follows her and they are reconciled. And despite the disapproval of General Tilney, they are married. So you can see how this romantic plot survives this Gothic, machinery, and it survives the lack of money and fortune, and it ends happily for the central couple. Now let's see how the Gothic novel is referenced in Northanger Abbey. So in the first half of the book, which is set in fashionable Bath, we see Catherine meeting Isabella Thorpe, who's a flighty young woman. She looks like she's a flighty young woman, but she's very calculating and strategic. You can see how she easily discards the brother of Catherine Morland once she realizes that he doesn't have a lot of money, and goes for the eldest son of General Tilney. So you can see in some regards that she is also kind of mirroring General Tilney in the kind of choices that she makes about marriage partners. When Catherine opines that she wishes she could spend her whole life in reading Anne Radcliffe's hugely popular and influential Gothic novel, The Mysteries of Udolpho, Isabella replies that she has made out a list of 10 or 12 more of the same kind for you: Castle of Wolfenbach, Claremont, Mysterious Warnings, Necromancer of the Black Forest, Midnight Bell, Orphan of the Rhine, Horrid Mystery. So these are all titles of Gothic fiction, and she kind of offers this list to her friend, her new best friend, Catherine Morland. And you can see how friendships are formed through this kind of exchange. And these are actual titles of real books that they came out in that period. So, for some time in the 19th century, it was generally believed that Austen may have made up these titles, so preposterous did they sound to later non-Gothic readers. How later scholarship revealed that the novels did all exist, and they are all on display together for the first time in Terror and Wonder, which is an exhibition in the British Library. So you can see how these titles, the titles referred to in the slide, are all not made up titles by Austen. They were actual texts that were circulating in that period, and they are all on display in the exhibition that was run by the British Library in 2015. In the second half of the novel, especially during the travel to Northanger Abbey, we can see Catherine being teased by Henry about the novels that she had read. And he kind of teases Catherine about what she expects the house Northanger Abbey to be like, and of course Catherine has had imagined a full-on Radcliffean, dark, brooding, maze-like building stuffed with secrets. And Henry asks, and are you prepared to encounter all the horrors that a building such as what one reads about may produce? Have you a stout heart, nerves fit for sliding panels and tapestry? So his references here are some of the attributes of Gothic fiction: the sliding panels, the tapestry, hiding horrid things, and all the maze-like buildings and the darkness and the brooding ambience of Gothic castles are actual part and parcel of fiction that Catherine had read, just as Isabella Thorpe had. So when Henry is kind of teasing her, he's also setting up Northanger Abbey as a place with a lot of potential for Gothic terror and horror. And it is these elements which kind of create a particular mood in Catherine Morland about the structure, Northanger Abbey, and she tries to kind of, bring back her reading and see the world through the pages of the works that she had read. Henry also proceeds to distill various key plot lines from the complete works of Anne Radcliffe into a single very entertaining narrative at what is to happen at the Abbey during Catherine's visit. His intention is to entertain, but Catherine is both frightened and immediately expects the worst or the most exciting to happen. So while Henry is teasing, he also kind of condenses some of the key plot lines of Anne Radcliffe's works into a single entertaining plot, and Catherine is really frightened at what he had been sketching out for her benefit, but she is simultaneously frightened as well as excited by the prospect. So this is what is underlining some of the Gothic philosophies. To be frightened is also to be excited, and we did see in the previous lectures how there is a kind of a sexual subtext to this kind of excitement when the Gothic heroine is moving through the labyrinthine passageways. She is somehow kind of exploring the forbidden, and the forbidden could be the sexual as well. Thank you for watching. I'll continue in the next session.